Okay, well, hello and welcome everyone to the third episode of Steep and Think. Before I hand over to Megan, my co-host, for those of you joining for the first time, is a quick word on what we're actually doing here. So Steep and Think lives as a spot that sits a little uneasily at the intersection of innovation and humanity in GTM. And there's the thing about AI and B2B right now. Everyone's picked a camp. 10% will tell you it's the end of the days. Another 10% will tell you it solves all problems. The 80% in between, that's what our show is about. No bullshit, excuse language, and honest conversations with people like our guest today, who I'll hand over to Megan to introduce. So buckle up, listen in, and ask some questions as we go. We'll be watching the chat. Don't just sit there, engage, and make it your show as well.
All right, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, and for those of you joining us again, thank you. That's an honor. We are very excited to welcome today's guest, Miguel Gernaey, who I've known for longer than I care to admit through my Serious Decisions days, and his storied career in a number of different marketing leadership roles, and his latest role, which is that of co-author of a book that I've had the privilege of previewing, Digital Availability, and we're going to be talking about that concept today. But before we do, a little bit about Miguel before we have him introduce himself. He has spent more than 30 years working with B2B technology companies to help them leverage marketing and their brand for better growth and commercial transportation. And that has led him to this place where he is now the author of a book that will be coming soon to a store near you, Digital Availability, with his co-author, 𝗓𝘓𝘓𝘓𝘓, that is looking at how AI and changes in buyer behavior are really reshaping how we think about growth in B2B. So nobody better to bring that perspective of what was to what will be. And even better, in his spare time, he is an olive and soon to be truffle farmer in Tuscany. So time permitting, we'll hear just a little bit more about that cool part of your career trajectory that not many people get to have. But Miguel, I would love for you, first of all, and welcome. We're thrilled you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And we would love for you to talk with us a little bit about what led you to want to write this book and sort of what changed about the B2B landscape that made you think we need to be thinking about things a little bit differently.
Well, I mean, for me, there's a couple of things, right? I mean, there is all the conversations that you see constantly about how buyers have changed. And, you know, people forming shortlists on day one, you know, people being 70% through their journey before they contact, vendors, you know, the brands versus demand conversations. And then, of course, the AI conversations, which have recently exploded. And I kind of felt that, you know, a lot of people were talking about the problem. But very few people, you know, frustratingly so, there, you know, every time I read one of those posts, it was like, well, what do we do differently, right? We all know buyers have changed. We all know AI is here. We all know that, you know, brand is important, but demand is also important. So what do we do differently? So the book is partly, you know, it came out of frustration, right? And as you know, Megan, I started thinking about digital availability many years ago, and in fact came on a podcast with you and John, and you then suggested, there's a book in this, you should write a book. So one of the reasons why I wrote the book is actually because of what you said back then. But also, you know, I came to the conclusion that, you know, most the B2B operating model that we use today is 2 decades out of, you know, 2 decades old, and it's been, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but it's been, let's call it broken for the sake of argument, for those 2 decades, right? You know, there'll be a lot of, you know, people in B2B marketing can tell you everything about that part of the market that they can see. And the part of the market that they can see is what enters their CRM, right? So if you imagine, you know, a company that has a serviceable, obtainable market of, say, 10,000 accounts, right? And say they generate 300 opportunities every year. So those 300 opportunities is the part of the market, that's the 10,000, that is visible in their CRM. And everybody, most everybody, focuses on optimizing what they can see in the funnel, right? Conversion rates from MQL to opportunity to, whatever. But then I started thinking, what about the 9,700? Those 9,700 are not accounts that are out of market. They're in market. And they are, buying groups form in those accounts. They explore options. They choose favorites. And all of that is happening out in the open, but is, mostly not visible to vendors, right? And I think that's the blind spot that 2 decades of stasis has produced in the B2B marketing operating model, right? Companies cannot tell you anything about the 9,700 accounts because they don't show up in their CRM, right? They're not recorded as lost deals, right? And that's the blind spot. Right? We don't know anything about those. And I thought there has to be a way whereby we can understand whether over time we're actually capturing more of our SOM or less of our SOM, and then have the ability to do something about that, right? And that's what we, that's really what our digital availability book offers, is a new operating model for B2B marketing, where inclusion in buying journeys and AI recommendations, for example, is engineered deliberately rather than hoped for, which, if you do it right, will ultimately allow you to increase what we call your SOM capture, right? In the example that I've given, 10,000 accounts in the SOM, 300 opportunities, they have a SOM capture rate of 3%, right? If you can increase that SOM capture rate, then obviously, your ability to grow is much larger than if you continue to focus inside the funnel and optimize inside the funnel.
And just in case people aren't as familiar with those acronyms as those of us who spend lots of time in the 3-letter acronym world, remind us those key acronyms that you're referring to when you talk about digital availability and how people need to think of their market.
So when we look, in this case through a product marketing lens, right, we will see, there are 3 ways to look at the market, if you like. One is your total available market, which we call your TAM, right? Then there is your serviceable available market. In other words, that part of the market where you have product market fit, right? So your SAM is a subset then of your TAM, but that's the actual market that you can, serve with your product or service. And then you have the SOM, which is the serviceable obtainable market, which is that part of your SAM that is actually in market in a particular time period, let's say a year, to buy your product, right? And that's where things like the 95-5 rule that the LinkedIn B2B Institute came up with, where they say 95% of your buyers are out of market in any year and 5% are in market. Now, whether that's 5% or 10% and 90% depends a little bit on your category. But the important numbers here are your serviceable available market, so your SAM, because that's where you have product market fit, right? All of the people in the TAM where you don't have product market fit, you can't sell to, so they're irrelevant, right? So your SAM is relevant, and then of course your SOM is hugely relevant, because you need to understand how many of your buyers are actually in market in any given year to be able to then measure your SOM capture and those kinds of things.
Yep. Thanks for that. And I hope the product marketers who are listening are realizing just
Hey, me too.
how incredibly critical their role is these days.
Yes.
But let's turn things over a little bit. I'm going to turn things over to Dorothea and let's start to get into, what all this means then when we talk about digital availability.
Yes, that's actually, I was going to hop straight on the next question of definition. So I hadn't come across the term digital availability, and I wonder if our audience has. So maybe you could give us your definition of it, and then tell us a version that you've used with the CFO.
Yes. So let me tell you what I was inspired by, because I think that's probably an important thing. I don't know if you've ever read this wonderful book called How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp, which is really, it has a small B2B element to it, but it's mainly a B2C, brand book, if you like. And in it, he talks about mental availability and physical availability. So, mental availability is, how, which brand comes to mind in a buying situation, right? Say you're driving up to a petrol station, you're thirsty, you take petrol, you go inside, you're in a buying situation because you're thirsty, and you grab for a Coke, right? Which means the mental availability for Coke is high for you, right? Because you're thirsty, buying situation, that's the brand that comes to mind. But of course, then your Coke has to be physically available in the fridge, in the petrol station, and preferably available in such a way that it's right at eye level, so you can just grab it. You don't have to bend down and take it from the bottom shelf or whatever, right? So Byron Sharp talks about mental availability and physical availability, mostly in the context of building B2C brands, right? And I thought at the time when I was writing the book is that it has to be an equivalent for B2B marketing. And so I came up with the concept of digital availability, which is really a combination of mental availability and physical availability, but for B2B marketing, right? And so the way Andrea and I define digital availability is that it is the systematic management of how findable, present, and arresting your brand is across the entire buyer journey. So wherever buyers discover, research, compare, and decide, and then in that, findability, presence, and arresting power across paid, owned, earned, and AI-mediated touch points or surfaces. Right. So, in essence, it is how findable, present, and arresting your brand is there where your buyers are. Right. And where your buyers are on your owned surfaces, your earned surfaces, your paid surfaces, and now increasingly AI-mediated surfaces or touch points.
That is really interesting. So how do you translate that into language a CFO will understand? And
well, if you can, what we've done actually is we have connected digital availability, or the degree of digital availability that you have within a business, to a financial model, right? Because when you think about it in B2B, your annual new revenue, and I'm not talking about customer marketing now for a second, because that's excluded from our book. We're talking about new customer acquisition. Your annual new revenue is your serviceable obtainable market times your capture rate, right? That will give you the number of opportunities that you capture out of your song, right? Times your entry position weighted win rate, right? Because if you are part of the day one shortlist that 77% of buyers, decide, that the number one on their day one shortlist is who they're going to buy from, then, you're going to be earlier in the deal than everybody else, and you're going to have a much higher chance of winning, right? So you need to, weigh your win probability based on where you enter the deal. And we chapter 11 in our book, once it comes out in September, describes this in great detail and how you implement it in a business, etc. Right? So it's your SOM times your capture rate times your entry position weighted win probability times your average deal size. Right?
I like that.
And so, because we wanted to make this measurable, right? And because if you don't make it measurable, then it's very hard to have a conversation with the CFO, because you're right back to, brand conversations, for example, right? Where you say, hey, we're going to spend a whole lot of money, but we can't really, tell you what that will mean in terms of, new revenue. Whereas with digital availability, we can do that, because digital availability produces outcomes. The same digital availability system produces outcomes over 2 time horizons. In the short term, it increases your SOM capture, right? So if you think about the example that I've given, if your SOM capture rate is 3% out of a SOM of 10,000 accounts, and you'll have 300 opportunities. If your SOM capture rate increases by 1 percentage point, then you'll have 400 opportunities. Plus, out of those new opportunities that enter your pipeline, the chances that you're an early entry vendor, that day one shortlist, are going to be much higher, right? The second outcome over the longer term is increased mental availability in your SAM, so your serviceable available market, right? Because if you don't increase your mental availability in your SAM, then ultimately there's going to be a ceiling in your SOM capture, right? Because you need to make sure that more of your buyers know who you are on day one, when they do the day one shortlist, basically, right? So the conversation, and if you could put up the visual, Megan, that we have, we've actually developed an audit system for digital availability, where we can go into a business and say, here is the state of the nation when it comes to your digital availability. And this is a different example here, but the basic premise is the same. We look at the trend in your SOM capture rate, right? So you see there the 3.1% has actually gone down from 3.8% over time. So in this business, the SOM capture rate is declining. And then we use the digital availability system, which consists of 3 elements. The first one is the foundation, right? You need to have a strong foundation of brand and product marketing. The second is the digital availability engine, or the digital availability system, right? So that's your findability, your presence and your arresting power. And then there's the AI architecture that allows your digital availability operating model to scale, right? And what we do is we provide basically a maturity score for each of those 3 elements of the of that digital availability operating model. And so in this particular case, you can have a conversation with a CFO that says, hey, your SOM capture is 3.1%, right? It's gone down from 3.8% 2 years ago, right? If you increase your SOM capture by 1 percentage point, you can, your extra revenue that you can generate is $47 million, right? Because it's easy to calculate, right? Your SOM, instead of 300 opportunities, you have 400 opportunities. Your entry position weighted win rate, will go up because you will be in more deals earlier. And then times your average deal size, we can tell you exactly how much more revenue you should be able to, to generate by improving the maturity of your digital availability, right? And then we can say, in order to get to that 4.1% or whatever it is, you have an emerging maturity on the digital availability engine, right? So your findability, presence, and arresting power across your paid, owned, and earned and AI-mediated surfaces. And then there will be detail behind it as to what needs to be done in paid, what needs to be done in owned, in order to get that maturity level up. Same principle for your AI, architecture, right? Because the way most people use AI today is for efficiency, right? But that's completely the wrong instinct, because you can be more efficient. You can produce, let's say, for the sake of argument, more content with less. But more volume doesn't mean more relevance, does it? In fact, more volume that's not based on a solid foundation of brand and product marketing can mean eroded relevance over time. And if your relevance erodes, you're not going to be included as often in AI, outcomes, because you're less relevant. Right? You may also become less findable. So anyway, in my opinion, the use of AI for efficiency purposes is the wrong instinct, right? I'm not saying that it can't be used for that. It can, absolutely, and it should, right? But it's not the main use of it. The main use of it should be buyer centricity, because now with AI we can finally really put our money where our mouth is in terms of buyer centricity.
That is excellent. There's actually an interesting question I was going to ask you. You partly covered it, but nearly 9 in 10 B2B purchases now involve AI. So you give me the keyword AI features. And 6sense found that most vendor sites fail to explain what AI looks for in support of buying. If a buyer is researching your category through an AI assistant right now, what do they see, and whose job is it to fix that? What do you think about that?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the way I look at it is when buyers use AI, basically what they're using AI for is to synthesize the vendor landscape on their behalf, right? Then you have to think about, where does the AI go to find the information, right? The AI will go to your paid, owned, and earned surfaces, right? It will go to your website. So if you don't have content on your website that's easily readable and understandable by AI, by LLMs, then you have a problem, right? Because it's not going to, understand what it's seeing, right? And again, that always then goes back down to the foundation, right? If your value proposition isn't described properly in language that LLMs can understand and buyers can understand, if your AI capability within that value proposition isn't defined properly, then the LLM isn't going to find it, right? Or isn't going to understand it, or think it's irrelevant, or whatever, right? So actually, we have a metric that we describe in the book, which is AI inclusion rate. It tells you how often are you included in AI outcomes based on, specific prompts. But the problem is, when you're not included in AI outcomes very often, you're going to have to go back to your paid, owned, and earned surfaces, because that's where, the LLMs get their information. Right. So, for example, a business that I worked in recently had no reviews on G2, for example, or the way they were represented on G2 and Gartner Digital Markets and that sort of thing was so bad that it would have been better to have nothing. And so now you think about a vendor, or a buyer saying, I want information about this specific company. It goes, in order to to give the most complete answer, it's going to go to all these review sites, right? And in fact, Gartner and others have, G2 and others have AI assistants on their sites that help vendor, so that's then the first, if you use those, it's the first place they go, is your earned properties, right? So if you don't show up, your digital availability audit will tell you you're not showing up because your maturity level in your earned surfaces is 0.5 out of 5, or your maturity level on your earned surfaces, on your own surfaces, is, 1 out of 5 because your value proposition isn't defined properly. You're not using language that LLMs, find easy to interpret, etc. Right? And that's another reason why we developed the audit instrument, because it will tell you, where you're going wrong when you're not showing up in AI outcomes.
So maybe just a little more kind of on that thread. So Miguel, you've worked in some pretty significant B2B brands, and tech brands in particular. So you've seen a few things maybe that weren't where you wanted them to be when you got to these companies. What are some of the first things you'd advise a CMO or other senior marketing leader to look for to know if they've got a serious digital availability problem? Kind of, if you're thinking about sort of what you've seen across the companies as you've looked to apply your digital availability system, what kinds of things are showing up as the most alarming symptoms of invisibility?
It depends a little bit on the business, but I would say, usually what's quite alarming is the earned properties, right? Because they're often not managed actively within a business. Right. So you have, for example, in the business that I referenced earlier, there was nobody managing the, G2 sites and how that business was represented there. There was no program in place in the business to, get additional reviews up there. There was no program whereby we went back to new customers after, 2 months or whatever and asked them to write a review. There was none of that. So they were entirely invisible, digitally invisible. And I would actually say negatively invisible because of the, the presence that they had, but effectively they were digitally invisible on their earned properties, right? It's going to be very hard to show up in LLM outcomes if you're completely invisible there, right? And the other thing that I see more often than not is that there is no, and this is why we harp on quite a bit around the foundation for the digital availability operating model, which is brand and product marketing, right? When I first went to work for that particular business, it took me an hour searching their website to find out what it is that they actually did, because the value propositions weren't clear, right? And then, if you have an unclear value proposition to begin with, and then you want to layer on AI to that, the only thing you're going to do is make it more unclear, right? So sometimes, or oftentimes, I think people need to go back to the basics, and I need to say, who is our ideal customer profile? What's their, what's the value proposition? What are our buyers' needs? How do our buyers define their problems? All that brilliant work that good product marketers do needs to be in place, because otherwise you could create digital invisibility because you're irrelevant, because the LLMs and the buyers can't understand you, right? And then there are other things like, in that same business, they were reasonably findable, but they weren't present because they didn't do simple things like retargeting, for example. So buyers could find them once, but then there wasn't repeat exposure and encounters with that buyer that is needed to form the mental structures for, mental availability, and the structures that are necessary to build trust and and preference, right? So digital invisibility can show up in many different areas in the business, and again, our digital availability audit will show you where you are maybe findable but not present. Where you're findable and present, but you don't have any arresting power. In other words, when buyers encounter you, they don't sit up and take notice of you, or you don't build trust through the encounters that the buyers have with you because your content is too generic, or you have no reviews, or any of those things, right? So it can show up in digital invisibility can show up in findability, in presence, in arresting power, and it can show up across all of the 4 surfaces paid, owned, earned, and AI mediated.
Well, and we got an interesting question from one of our listeners today, or viewers today, I should say, Rajesh, and he's asking about how does one improve digital availability for a new category that buyers might not be searching for yet? And I guess my question to you, Miguel, is sort of twofold, which is, one, is digital availability primarily a concept that supports more mature, established markets and categories? Or would you see a way that you need to think about this if you are, in fact, part of a newer category or you're trying to establish one?
I think obviously it works really well for established categories. But I think it also works for new categories, because what it offers you is the opportunity to get it right from the start. Right? But when you think about it, if you're going to build digital availability for a new category, right? Get your foundation right. Whatever your brand positioning is, all the wonderful product marketing things that I've just mentioned there. Get all that right, because if you get that right, then you're going to get a lot of the content that's going to live, on your owned properties, for example. You're going to get that right, especially if you then also look through the lens of what LLMs need to be able to do there. So I think it's absolutely applicable to new categories as well, because you can follow the same system, and then you can make sure that when buyers do start to research in that category, right, that you have the best digital availability of all of the entrants in that category, if you like.
Well, and I would even argue you could sort of do an end run around it with being present when people ask about solutions to the challenge that you're solving for.
Exactly.
Yeah, so there's a few ways. That's not an easy one. New category creation is its own thing. We should bring someone on to talk about that.
You should. I mean,
it's a topic for another day.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
But before we move off of this one, and I hand over things back to Dorothea. One of the challenges I think that a lot of organizations are having now is they budgeted for the old model that had you thinking more is more, and that you didn't necessarily need to optimize for a fourth category of things that, of buyers, essentially, a different type of buyer, AI assisted. If you're thinking as a marketing leader and a CFO and you're thinking, what trade-offs do I need to make in my budget? What are some of the areas that you see needing to change in order to maximize your digital availability, kind of using the system that you've built?
Yeah, very, very, very good question. I mean, I think you need to have the right level of investment in the outputs that are needed for the foundation, right? So your brand positioning, your brand manifesto, your brand promise, all of those kinds of things. And then all of the product marketing things that we've already mentioned, right? That because if you don't have that foundation, you have nothing to base all of the improvements across your surfaces on, right? You also will find it very difficult to implement the AI architecture, because the AI architecture that we present in the book has an insights layer. And basically that insights layer has all the brand information, all the buyer information, all the value proposition information, so that when you ultimately get to a production point, content or whatever it may be, the AI system will leverage all those insights that you have to produce the best possible, piece of content or outcome that, thing that it's asked to produce, basically. So that needs to be invested in properly. And then I think when it comes to, the other areas, so the digital availability system, I think part of it will be moving money around, right? Because, you can say, well, hey, we're highly findable, but we're not present. So, maybe we can be a little less findable, but more present. So we're moving some money from there to there. You may need to invest in your earned properties. So again, that's why we have the audit, because we will be able to tell people, in quite some detail, where there is additional investment needed, and where you can move things around from the existing budget that you have from one place to the other to improve your, your digital availability. I think the strong point is that you will always be able to put it against, increased SOM capture. And if you can say, hey, if we do all these things and we spend a little more money, but it's going to give us an additional 50 million in revenue annually, then, that's the language a CFO understands, right? Then you don't have to say, hey, trust me, we're going to do brand investment and it's going to be great. And we're ultimately going to see an increase in revenue, right? But I can't prove it. With the digital availability system, you can prove it. But then you need to go do it, obviously, right? But the system works, and the revenue equation is simple enough, but powerful enough to be able to say, hey, we can do this much more revenue, but we have to invest, say $1 million or whatever. I mean, your ROI of investing $1 million and getting 50 million out is, it's a no-brainer, right? Or it should be a no-brainer anyway. And that's why we really wanted to develop that financial model, which, as I said, will be chapter 11 in the book. Remember that. And you've already read it, Megan, right? Because you've had a preview. Yeah, so I think that for me becomes very important, because you can, you can more specifically say what money you need for what. And because it's all the same system that produces outcomes over 2 timeframes. So in other words, you have your increased SOM capture, but you also, because you're now more findable, present, and arresting all the time with all of your buyers, regardless of whether they're out of market or in markets, right? It will build those memory structures in your SAM, or build your brand, build awareness, build, whatever you want to call it. I call it mental availability, which is obviously built over a longer period of time, but you can prove it. So the whole brand versus demand debate is over.
Yeah.
Because you can achieve both of these things. You can achieve both of these things with the same system.
I like that. And you've kind of given a great advice here on how people can make the case for that investment and deliver the tool for them. That I think that is really, really brilliant. That's what lots of folks lack, this objective or objectified view into it. But since our show is also about the human connection, I have one more question for you that strays away from there. It's all about in an AI mediated market, why is human connection still the thing that decides it? And what do the best B2B brands get right emotionally?
So first of all, I think people need to understand that B2B buying is emotional. I think a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, I was in a presentation by Kerry Cunningham, your old colleague from Serious Decisions, Megan, and he put up a slide that I never forgot, and it was the first slide in his presentation, and there was only one sentence on it, and it said, "B2B buying is hard." And so it was only 4 words. But before I saw those 4 words, I had never really thought about it in that way, right? And when you think about it, it is hard, isn't it? I mean, you have a committee of up to 10 people. Your career could be at risk if you choose the wrong, vendor. You have to get along with all these people and reach a consensus. And some may feel differently about something than others, right? Note I said feel, right? Yep. So there's a lot of emotions involved in B2B buying, isn't there? And I think that is the ultimate limitation of AI, especially now. You never know how it evolves. But AI doesn't understand emotion, right? And I think governing emotions in B2B buying journeys is done through relevance. Right? Are you relevant to that person in that moment? Right? Are you relevant enough to build trust so that they feel differently about you? Are you relevant enough so they can understand, what you're offering very quickly, so they don't get annoyed and frustrated? more feelings, right? So when you think about it, you know, if people ask me, say, if you're always relevant when you're being found, when you're present, and you know you're relevant and arresting. That's why we call it arresting power in the digital availability system. You know, that's how you manage emotions in a B2B buyer journey, to my mind. But I think that, you know, before we get there, we have to get more people on board with the fact that B2B buying is hard and it is emotional, right? So if you then can also build a brand that has emotional resonance with, you know, with your commercial universe, so your serviceable addressable market, brilliant, right? Because then you can get that emotional resonance going all the way through all of your surfaces and, you know, your content and your experiences. And if you then know that you need to be relevant in each of those encounters in the right way for the particular emotion that that buyer may have in that moment, then you're winning, I think, from an emotional perspective.
I can certainly corroborate that from my time working on strategic deals, large deals. There are hundreds, millions and beyond. And it was highly emotional. It was highly complex. And the relevance was the gold standard. But you've put that brilliantly. So Megan, with that, I think I would hand back over to you though.
All right, Miguel. Well, I would say two things to close with. We've got lightning round questions, but before we do that, just maybe a little word to the wise for our audience. What are some of the ways to position this internally when people need to make this shift to really help people embrace the idea that B2B buying is hard and emotional, and you need to do things differently if you want to be able to compete for that market you can't see? How do you sell it?
Well, I think you start by, well, I would say start by doing an audit, digital availability audit, right? Because I think you need to create a burning platform, don't you? You know, and if I come to you and I say, hey, Megan, and you say you're my CEO, and I say, hey, Megan, you know, our SOM capture is 3%, which means that we're missing out on 9,700 in that example deals every year, right? Do you think that's where we should be? All right. They're probably going to say no, right? That's not where we should be. That's not where we want to be. Do you know what I mean? But you know, but then you can take it a step further, right? Because you could say, hey, if our SOM capture doesn't increase, then our growth is always going to be limited to what we can optimize in the funnel, right? And you can calculate how much that is. If your SOM capture stays stable and you're only focusing on increasing your conversion rates within your funnel, you can calculate how much additional revenue you can get from that, right? It's not difficult to do. And then you can hold that against increased SOM capture. I can guarantee you now that you know, the increased SOM capture is always going to win over optimization in the funnel, right? In an ideal world, you do both, right? But if you have to choose one that has the biggest opportunity for growth, it's increased SOM capture. It's that simple.
Yeah, that near-term time horizon is always the winner, I feel like. But I think what I love about this is that the nice thing is it's not like you have to trade one for the other. Your near-term efforts really will pay off in the long term. And that's kind of the brilliance of the model, I think. Tell me just, okay, we're going to do a quick lightning round. What is one book everybody should read? I think you answered this, but tell us a book that we should be reading.
Yes. How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp.
Absolutely. And what is the most dangerous belief in B2B right now?
Oh, it's the MQL industrial complex, the funnel, that the funnel is your market, right? I mean, because that's what people can see. So that, you know, people think that's my market, right? But it's not. You know, if people take away one thing from this, think about the 10,000 accounts that are in market, think about the 3% song capture, and then think a lot about the 9,700 and what happens with them.
Love it.
Right?
Brilliant.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity in there. And before we talk about olives and truffles, one last thing: 5 years out, B2B teams who are winning, what did they get right starting today?
Well, digital availability, of course.
I think you had to say that.
Of course, I have to say that.
Dorothea close it out because she's got a working knowledge of truffles that I lack. So I will let her close things out for today.
Well, thank you. So my working knowledge of truffles, I found that Miguel is starting a truffle farm, and I, of course, have a dog that can find those. Miguel, tell us a little more about your truffle venture and when we can come and see you there.
Well, I mean, as you know, the first thing I have to do is see, do I already have truffles in my woodlands?
Yeah.
Because I bought some land last year, about 2 hectares, and it has 180 olive trees. So I'm now officially an olive farmer, and it has some woodlands and a field, and I want to plant a truffle plantation in the field. And I've already done a soil analysis. The soil is perfect for truffles, but I want to see, you know, do I already have truffles in my woodland? Which you could tell me if you came over with your dog,
Actually,
Dorothea,
yes.
because you have a truffle dog, and because then I know which you know, variety of truffle to plant.
Yeah.
You know, if I already have truffles, right? So which I should, because there's a lot of truffles in this area.
No, that's cool. I think brilliant. Thank you for that, and I think we will stay connected about that particular subject, as well as, of course, digital availability. Thank you so much.
Of course. Yes.
Well, and I think the only thing I contribute to this is perhaps cooking with the olive oil and the truffles when the time comes.
Oh yes, absolutely.
A post-book launch party, perhaps.
Yes, I also grow lots of other things. I grow tomatoes and zucchini and salads, and I have this big vegetable garden. In fact, today I had to pick tomatoes because there's so many of them. So I've been making passata all day, which is very interesting.
Okay. I love it. Well, then we'd all wish we were having dinner at your house this evening. Miguel, thank you so much for being here and for sharing this concept. And I hope people have taken away some really, really good advice, because you've certainly shared a ton of it. And everybody, keep an eye out. Coming soon, digital availability, and we will certainly post and share links so you can be first in line to get that book when it comes out. And congratulations, Miguel. Excited for you to be able to publish this.
Thank you. And thank you again for telling me to write it 3 or 4 years ago, or whatever it was. I can't remember exactly, Megan, because without your push, I may never have done it.
Well, somehow I think you would have gotten there in the end, but I'm pleased to be a part of it. And you had to do the hard part, actually writing the thing. So again, congratulations and thank you.
Thank
you. From Dorothea and from me, hope to see everybody next time on the next episode of Steep and Think.
Thank you.